Johann Baptist Joseph Maximilian Reger was born in March 1873 and would be the only surviving son of his parents' 4 kids. His father was a school teacher, and the family lived in several locations near the modern-day Czech border. His mom taught him piano, and early in his schooling, he displayed a penchant for mathematics. By 11, he was studying the organ with local teacher Adalbert Lindner, who gave him the basics of Mozart and Clementi and the usual pedagogical suspects, but also told the kid that he should pursue the music that spoke to him the most. To help Max in his studies, his dad repurposed a small instrument, no longer needed by the local school, into a home practice organ. He really grew up at the organ. He was subbing in for his teacher at the local parish when he was barely a teenager. But it wasn't until 1888, when Reger attended the Bayreuth Festival, that he decided he'd become a full-time musician. Entranced by performances of Wagner's operas, his first stab at a composition was an overture that got blown all out of proportion. Somehow Reger's juvenilia landed in the hands of Hugo Riemann. Sources conflict on whether it was Reger or Lindner who sent it off. He recognized Reger's budding talent, but Bayreuth was, in his words, a toxic influence on the youngster. Riemann suggested that Reger cut his teeth on smaller fare, quartets and songs instead of overtures that were trying to turn into one-movement symphonies, and he sent him some textbooks so he could study, including his own book on counterpoint. Riemann's correspondence, followed by similar encouragement from Josef Reinberger, then teaching in Munich, convinced Reger's doubtful parents. Reger doubled and tripled down on his theory studies to be ready for his first official semester of musical study with Riemann in April 1890. Reger was highly driven and ambitious, and Riemann's teaching style, which emphasized work ethic and encyclopedic knowledge, was a perfect fit. Perhaps too perfect. For a few years, it looked like everything was coming up Reger. He got a publisher in London, but soon the public began to sour on this newcomer. And to make ends meet, he was forced to make arrangements of other composers' pieces, and teach people he found, his quote here, mostly totally talentless. The press tore his few performed pieces to shreds. By the age of 25, he was so deep into debt and such an alcoholic that he had to move back in with his parents. They'd had their reservations about this whole music deal before, but by this point, his mother was open to the idea of him voluntarily committing himself to a mental institution. Riemann also saw Reger as a lost cause, as a composer destined to make his music too complicated and unnatural. To those who had cared for him the most, he was nothing but a waste of talent and potential. I think I might understand the heavy drinking now.
Boy, that Hennigan goes down smooth.
But Reger, undeterred, began writing the music that would establish his fame. As an organist, Reger inherited a grand and specific tradition that stretched back to well before the time of Johann Sebastian Bach, and he wrote in the forms common to the great German organist-composer tradition. Things like chorale preludes, the kind of old-fashioned genres that people just did not write in anymore. Karl Straube was his man on the bench for many of these early premieres. He served as an informal composition teacher and played Reger's work from manuscript to increasingly mixed reviews. And Riemann? Well, that was one long, drawn-out falling out. Riemann gave up hope in Reger once Reger began liking Liszt's music. They grew increasingly sick of the other, especially when Reger showed the first inklings of his mature style. At first, Riemann saw something of a son in Reger. He believed Max would turn out to be not just a great composer, but one who would promote Riemann's ideas. Reger wanted to fuse the lush harmonies of the late Romantic with structural ideas from the Baroque era, and Riemann could not get his head around that. The collapse began in 1895, when Reger got into a fight with Riemann's wife Elizabeth, and the Riemanns left Wiesbaden, leaving Reger behind to teach theory. And the relationship fully dissolved by 1907, when Reger and Riemann went at each other in a set of essays. Well, Riemann didn't actually mention Reger, but at this point Reger was so hot under the collar at his old teacher that he mistook Riemann's criticism of modern music as difficult to play as a personal attack. Reger rightfully pointed out that many things in Bach and Beethoven were considered impossible by its first performers. Weiden, where the Regers lived, was not a major metropolis, and Max really benefited from a move to the big city, Munich, with his family in 1901, when his dad retired from his teaching position. It wasn't a bad base of operations. By the turn of the 20th century, this was the epicenter of the music of the future, or the so-called New German School, or more accurately, what was left of that tradition. Richard Wagner and Franz Liszt, pioneers of that label, were a generation removed from this earthly life. Their acolytes were centered in Bavaria, and Munich, as its capital, was one of the hubs, the other being the fully Wagner-fied town of Bayreuth, 125 miles north. The music of the future was a rejection of past labels. Liszt wrote symphonic poems, not symphonies. Wagner wrote music dramas, not operas. It was a revolution of form as much as it was a revolution of how notes could be put together. Liszt, towards the end, edged towards full-on atonality, and Wagner generally thought of his operas in whole acts rather than individual scenes. And here was Reger, someone who felt the pull of the past, of the 3 Bs, of traditional forms and structures, surrounded by a musical culture that rejected so much of that tradition. Reger's mature music stands at the intersection of these two colliding forces in German musical life. I suspect that this was the reason for his testy critical reception, and the reason that his music is still so hard to pin down. It's drenched in the extreme chromaticism of the revolutionaries, mimicking much of the harmonic language of the New German School and their ideological descendants, but inheriting the very forms and structures that was the source of the revolutionaries' ire. You can see how a partisan for either side would see too much of the other in Reger. In Munich, they called him a reactionary, much to his personal shock and dismay. He borrowed the irregular phrase structures and motivic development from the New German School, but he kept the larger, older forms. It was a combination that only he pursued. But Munich was also a place where you could stay and carve out your niche. Reger was nothing if not always composing. By his marriage to Elsa von Birken in September 1902, he was up to Opus 65. Elsa was a Protestant and divorced from her first husband, so their marriage was yet another in a long string of letdowns to his parents, and to boot, a quick and easy way to get excommunicated from the Catholic Church. But this, even in Catholic Bavaria, didn't change his career trajectory, which was about to hit a major milestone with the premiere of his Opus 64 piano quintet. Some composers are perfectly happy to do their own thing, either immune from criticism or good at putting up a firewall between the talk and the work. Reger was not that. He was told by the traditionalists that his work was too crazy, and by the Munich clique that his work was too conservative. If someone told him his music was too complicated, he'd either make the piece crazy chromatic, even by his standards, or intentionally pare it down to something much simpler. Either way was a thumb in whatever critic's eye. When you combine this tendency with the habit of going through opus numbers like a broke college student going through ramen noodles, you get Reger's body of work. Massive, pretty variable, not easy to analyze or categorize. Works like the Opus 72 Violin Sonata or the Opus 74 String Quartet were called crazy and unnatural by critics, after positive reactions to the piano quintet had boosted his ego. So he went in a different direction with his Opus 77 trios. His biggest supporters didn't even know what to say when he would shun complexity for simplicity. They seemed to like him because the complexity, the constant modulation, the unending melody, the treatment of fragments of material was the point. All of this stylistic stuff is something that musicologists worry about. Posterity is the force that tries to categorize everything, put it into little boxes. In his time, as in ours, all press is still good press. Reger began writing his own articles against the critics who mocked him, and that violin sonata I mentioned was so polarizing that at its Frankfurt premiere, everyone who heard it came away with a strong opinion. By the end of 1904, Reger was in the top tier of the most performed German composers, lagging only behind Richard Strauss. With sound recording in its barest infancy, everyone just had to hear these polarizing pieces live and in person. People went to see his concerts because they were sensationalized and they were heavily marketed. Just because he only trailed Strauss in number of performances doesn't mean that people going to these concerts actually liked Reger or his music as much as they liked Strauss and his. But hey, if all press is good press, it means that this fame catapulted him to a post at the Munich Academy of Music. Reger's reverence for tradition manifested, as it did for Brahms, in a fear of the symphony. Beethoven laid down the gauntlet, so to speak, and Reger tiptoed around it, writing fragments of symphonies he thought of as preparation for a big one that never materialized. In the middle of 1905, he finished his Sinfonietta, and in 1908, he wrote his Symphonic Prelude to a Tragedy, which is basically one huge first movement. He was very slowly approaching the symphony, that great big white whale of the post-Beethoven German composer. The Sinfonietta is another one of the turning points in Reger's career, and its 18-month gestation was a lot for a guy who, again, was churning out pieces like Hollywood churns out mentally broken former child actors. Too dark? It's too dark. His habit of going big and never going home meant that Opus 90 was more like a symphony, and I'm with the majority opinion here that it's over-orchestrated, especially for a sinfonietta. That word implies a more soloistic treatment than Reger gives us in this piece. Nobody gets a break for that long here, and on those grounds I think it's kinda taxing to listen to. But if you go into it thinking symphony, it's likely to make more sense. After all, at about 50 minutes for a sinfonietta, what would a Reger symphony be, 3.5 hours? Because it was so long and so symphonic in scope, the premiere was apparently a bit of a shouting match. Reger alleged that his Munich enemies distributed 200 free tickets to people who would hiss at his music. A few days later, Reger's acolytes went to the house of one of Reger's mortal enemies in the press, Rudolf Louis, and sang and shouted in front of it, mocking him for his critical review in the Munich press. Reger stood behind his music. How, he wondered, could critics pass judgment on a work of such complexity after one hearing? All the same, he felt it necessary to smooth the waters again with his Opus 95 Serenade. was no surprise that Reger, a scion of tradition in his own special way, would wear out his welcome in a Munich that never fully took him in. So he packed up and moved the family to Leipzig just as soon as he got a job there in early 1907. His publisher always wanted smaller, simpler works. No surprise there, because you could sell those to the amateur crowd and make money if you're the publisher. With an academic post and a steady stream of conducting gigs, the Regers had the financial security that allowed him to focus only on big works. And for those of you keeping score at home, we're up to Opus 101 with the Violin Concerto, just another mammoth beast of a piece. He and Elsa also adopted 2 daughters, Krista and Lottie. His time was increasingly eaten by non-compositional projects. You really gotta wonder what stratospheric opus numbers he could have reached if he wasn't busy touring around and teaching so much. Leipzig was not that much kinder to Reger. I think he moved there expecting a reset, but he felt as outcast there as anywhere else. Pieces that met great success in other cities fell flat in Leipzig. Cologne liked him. Dortmund liked him so much they put on a Max-Reger festival in May 1910. And apparently the worst thing about that was that they didn't market it all that well. By the end of the next year, Reger had gotten so fed up with Leipzig, it made Munich look good in comparison. The grass is always greener, I suppose. The premiere of his piano concerto at the end of 1910 was one of the final straws. Opus 114 was supposed to be one of his big statements, something that would last for posterity and define his way forward for music. And Leipzig hated it, so he moved on. In December 1911, he began his tenure as conductor of the Meiningen Court Orchestra. His New Year's resolution was to give up drinking. He was too busy conducting and performing and, of course, composing to keep up his alcohol habit. Even his composition, like Mahler, got relegated to the summers when he had comparably more free time. The Meiningen post became a top-tier position when under the baton of Hans von Bülow, and Reger intended to keep it that way. Working one-on-one with an orchestra day in, day out, refined his orchestration chops. I think the Sinfonietta would have been better if he'd written it in, say, 1912 or 1913. Always indebted to the past, Reger's first piece there was his Opus 123 Concerto in the Old Style, which goes all the way back to the Baroque form of the Concerto Grosso. Again, something nobody was writing in and hadn't for many generations. His first full season there, Reger played or conducted in 106 concerts. Even his worst enemies in the press had to admit his leadership not only packed the houses, but maintained the von Bülow tradition. Heck, maybe even exceeded it. Reger found the role for him. And just as in his compositions, he was constitutionally unable to do it in moderation. Neither was he able to abstain from alcohol. Meiningen, like the cities before it, grew into a burden. He'd said ja to too many things. Heck, he was still taking weekly trips to teach in Leipzig. Just cut something out of your life, dude. We won't hold it against you, I promise. You might ask, why was he so set on going about and personally concertizing, rather than sitting from afar and letting other musicians interpret his work? From the letters that he left us, it really seems like he did not trust that the score would communicate all his ideas. Rather, he needed to be going around, doing concerts in various cities across Germany in order to build up a Reger performance tradition in each and every one. There was a method to the madness. In cities where he was known and liked, he could play his biggest, newest, or most demanding pieces. For newer or warier regions, he'd dip into his back catalog of easier listening, and only unleash the big boys when audiences got used to the smaller fare. I happen to think that his idea of tradition building was pretty extreme, and absolutely contributed to his eventual nervous breakdown. It didn't matter how many markings were in his scores, because he was also so involved in the performance side of things. He knew better than anyone that no amount of detail in a published piece can replicate the sound that he wanted without him being there. And yet, he spent time back and forth with publishers making sure all of those tiny details were exactly right. So it's the worst of both worlds. That ended up with more work on his plate, from revising drafts for publication to his punishing concert schedule. The way I see it, he only needed one or the other. Either trust your marks or trust that you can show him how it's done. Reger had precise ideas about his music well in advance of writing anything down. For any given piece, he knew its general character, its scope and scale, and even when he thought he might be through writing it. He wanted a performance tradition, so I think he also wanted a kind of mythos, giving the impression that he wrote massive pieces in his head by bragging about going straight into full score. He destroyed his sketches so thoroughly that for a while musicologists believed him. They believed that he went straight into full score. The surviving fragments that we do have are too idiosyncratic and too personal to be of much use. It's not like the Beethoven sketches that can actually tell us something about his process. Some of the sketch pages were recycled into wrapping material. I don't doubt that in comparison to other composers, Reger's sketches were less working things out and more outlines to jog the memory later. But he played it up. He would even lie to his publishers about how far along a piece or another was. He lied that Opus 147 just needed a couple of final checks. In reality, he wasn't done with the score in the slightest. And it's your publisher? I didn't see why I need to fib about that. Reger planned out stuff well in advance, so he had several irons in the fire. Or he knew exactly what needed to go into the fire next, up to a half dozen different plans. Unsurprising for a man teeming with so many ideas. After a score was fully done, he'd go over in red ink to add tempos, dynamics, and other performance indications. These are usually important to a composer's vision of their work, but not so much to Reger. This red ink addition stage was also his proofreading stage, at which point he might cross out sections or even big chunks of the score. He got away with it because his music doesn't operate in 4 square phrases. The tapestries of motivic and harmonic complexity allowed for last-minute deletion of material without the kind of adverse effects seen in other composers concerned with, like he was, things like sonata form. I think this helps explain why his biggest pieces are on such a vast scale. If a piece is huge, you can cut material at different stages without sacrificing the proportions between sections. But in other cases, the cuts, or notes to the conductor about proposed cuts, they were so radical that they did alter the form of the piece. And in some cases he had to fill in the missing material with new stopgap stuff. The snippets of material that bridged the gaps of these cuts were often variations on previous material, a practice that defied all notions of both classical proportion and romantic organicism. He was self-critical to a fault, and somewhat like fellow organist Anton Bruckner, amenable to suggestions for cuts from his trusted friends and colleagues. Not nearly as much as Bruckner, but they had similar tendencies. His massive output was always the sticking point. He was a throwback to a pre-romantic idea of genius, which is that genius was not what one was, but what one had. He didn't think that he was a genius, just a hard worker with great time management. Like Bach, he seemed to believe that industriousness was next to godliness. Meanwhile, critics couldn't make heads or tails of why he was so prolific. After all, times had changed since Bach needed to write a cantata every week or Mozart required some fresh concerto to play. Arnold Schoenberg thought he was a genius and wanted his music played more often because there was so much that was so little known. When Schoenberg set up his Society for Private Musical Performance in Vienna, Reger was their most played composer. And Schoenberg also revered Johannes Brahms.
Guten Tag! Johannes Brahms!
Reger is perhaps best understood as Brahms' successor. They both preferred absolute abstract music to the programmatic stuff of Liszt and Wagner. They were especially alike in their use of developing variation, a technique where all musical material is the result of developing a small starting motive. But where Brahms used developing variation in the context of clear formal structures, Reger's use is far more seat-of-the-pants. In many cases, it feels like it's the only thread holding the music together. The resulting music is harmonically dense, such that trying to suss out the important motives is easier said than done. Reger's music is organized, but in its own way. It's not easily comprehensible, and there's the rub. Developing variation is at its most comprehensible when the contour of the melody is preserved. That's what listeners pay attention to more than the individual pitches. But as Sarah McConnell points out in her 2018 dissertation on Reger's use of this technique, Reger sometimes obscures the contour. You can just see how these three could easily sound like different motives entirely, rather than variations on one underlying thing, especially for an inattentive listener. I find that it's pretty easy to look at how small motives get spun out, but it's harder to tell in performance because the music is so chromatic. At least my ear often gets to tracking the complex harmonic language. Put simply, I find the chromaticism can be distracting. You try to keep track of where you are in tonal space, and you can't hear the motives. Not unlike not being able to see the forest for the trees. And yet, it is this combination of classically, baroquely informed ideals and a very advanced tonal language that makes Reger sound like Reger. Reger wrote a lot on music, but almost never about himself. There is only one book that Reger left us, and it's tiny. It's the go-to practical handbook on modulation, and he was the man to do it. He could go from one key to any other in no time flat. Now, this book is not just small, it's really quite dry. There's one little boring chorale per modulation, and yeah, it's chromatic, but there are a lot of similarities between examples. 80% of the chromatic pivot chords are Neapolitan chords of some variety. That is, something that's a major flat 2 chord in the key he starts in, or the key he's going to. And as we've discussed, his music modulates a lot, but it's hardly cadential, and each of these examples ends with a cadence. Nevertheless, as Jane Ann Smith points out in her 2002 dissertation on this volume, there are some things we can learn about his music here. One is that he was thinking about this kind of thing at all. This was his only theoretical writing, so he found it worth the time to put together. Second is his avoidance of enharmonic modulations. Smith points out that augmented sixths, which are highly useful pivot chords, have to be enharmonically respelled into dominant sevenths if you want to use them as pivot chords. So Reger doesn't. It's sort of the perfect representation of surface-level late Romanticism with this deep underpinning of theory that, in a lot of ways, limits his choices in what chords he allows himself to use. This doesn't change the fact that when you're listening to Reger, you get the sense that he could use any chord at any time. He grounds it all in a tonal framework, but just barely. Beyond Reger lay atonality. No wonder Schoenberg liked him. Reger's music can be hard to play and analyze purely from a visual perspective. He's one of those composers who will have so many accidentals you wonder why he's even bothering with a key signature. The piano quintet is allegedly in C minor, but avoids any cadence in that key for a long time. The E minor piano trio is an even more egregious example. There's no cadential tonic in this piece until the first movement's coda. In the first chord of his Opus 72 violin sonata, it was said, had about as much to do with the purported tonic of C major as a crocodile had to do with Christmas. Christmas crocodile sounds like it'd be a Florida tradition. I guess they have alligators, though. I wonder if crocodiles also taste like chicken. Reger also dabbled in what I can only describe as binge smoking. His doctor said that Reger told him that at one point he'd smoked a box of 50 cigars in one go, which would probably kill a lesser man. Even then, they knew smoking wasn't, incredible for your health. And we gotta call it what it is. Self-destructive behavior, hiding behind a veneer of whimsical humor, sacrificing his body and his time on Earth to crank the Opus numbers just a little higher, to do one more concert.
Here's to feeling good all the time.
The nicotine kept him awake, to put down one more bar, to study one more score. Duke Georg II, who had significant correspondence with Reger, was one of the many who worried about him, writing in 1913 that Reger took his concert tours to the extreme. The year before, Reger had written to him, in one of his typical letters complaining about the amount of work on his plate, saying he'd not had 10 days consecutive vacation in 10 years. His work-hard, play-hard lifestyle caught up to him all at once. In February 1914, just after a concert in Hagen, Reger collapsed. The ensuing month-long convalescence at a sanatorium put things into perspective. He quit trying to be all things to all people in Meiningen, which opened his schedule for more composition. Boy, I don't think this guy has a single rest day outside of the hospital. Mercy sakes, good buddy. After World War I broke out, the Regers moved to Jena, a city famous for its intellectual life. Their house there was the first one of which he felt truly proud. Reger always had a snarky and goofy sense of humor. Perhaps the best-known anecdote is the note he sent to a critic who panned the premiere of his Sinfonietta. Very likely Rudolf Louis, but sources vary. "I'm sitting in my house's smallest room," he wrote. "I have your critique in front of me. In the next moment, it will be behind me." His letters to friends are full of whimsical statements and doodles, from copious ledger lines to a sign that said, "Attention, disinfect triads, barricade pianos." He liked underlining things, and he knew it, so at one point, under the guise of not having underlined enough in his last letter to the same guy, he sent a page of just lines. He'd write whole letters in silly phonetic German full of nonsense words, excessive umlauts, and inserted letters. Even at the sanatorium, he dressed up like an old lady and had his picture taken while striking a very serious pose. Max-Reger nearly reached Opus 150. He died of a heart attack on May 11, 1916, in a hotel room in Leipzig, where despite the wartime travel restrictions, he had nonetheless gone on one of his many, many concert engagements. He was only 43, but his constant stress and chronic periods of alcoholism had taken an enormous toll on his body. Pictures of him towards the end of his life tell the whole story. He looks older than his years, was tired, and extremely disheveled. The 20th century was a time of technological revolution, where years felt like decades of progress, and Reger felt artistically alone. He pushed himself beyond his limits to assure that he would have some kind of legacy, pushed to the point of exhaustion and finally death, knowing full well his bleak family history and what would come of his chronic substance abuse. The sad irony is that with the Great War as the finale of the long 19th century, the late Romantic era ended. What also ended was the Reger tradition that the man himself had spent so long cultivating. Tastes changed. Mere months after his death, as the obituaries piled up, asking many questions about what would come of Reger in posterity, the Max-Reger Society came together under the auspices of Mendelssohn's granddaughter-in-law, Edith, who was a friend of the Regers. In the early years of the Weimar Republic, the Society was successful in promoting Reger, but factionalism broke it apart as that regime crumbled. A lot of this was on Elsa Reger, who alienated herself from the Society. Reger's legacy was kept alive less by the Society than by other factors. The first is that Schoenberg was a fan, as mentioned, even if his private performances couldn't change a Viennese tastes. The second was the interwar sense of German patriotism, a desire to play only homegrown music, as a middle finger to the oppressive conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. Reger's prolific output and focus on the organ earned him a fan with Paul Hindemith and the New Objectivity movement. Hindemith said that he owed Reger a greater debt than Bach, which seems like a bit much. To be fair, he did say this to one of Reger's old students. None of this was ever enough to get Reger played outside of the German-speaking world, and it was about to get worse. Reger's monumental style and his World War I-era patriotic music made him a favored composer in the Nazi era. This made him iffy at best after the war, especially in West Germany, and Elsa Reger was left destitute after starting the Max-Reger-Institute, which inherited the Reger copyrights on her death in May 1951. She had long since had to sell much of the original memorabilia, which the Institute slowly bought back from the drip, drip, drip of royalties. The only performance tradition was at the organ, and even that was compromised. Reger's work, and this actually surprised me, is usually for chamber ensemble. I always thought he was mostly an organ composer. He does have a ton of organ music to his name, don't get me wrong. Any composer writing so much for organ was, in and of itself, a throwback to a bygone era. But going into this episode, I really thought we'd be talking a lot more about his organ music, but that only accounts for 20% of his total output. In other words, 200 individual pieces. How do you count them is admittedly tricky. You could do opus numbers. Do you count individual movements? How much do you count the stuff that never got an official publication? No matter how you slice it, the point still stands. He wrote a lot of organ music, and it wasn't even a plurality of what he did. Reger's organ literature always stayed around through Reger's pupils and grandpupils, but it was subject to much revision, thanks to the organ movement that sprung up during the Weimar Republic and lasted well beyond the Nazi years, and lasted well beyond the borders of Germany. In short, the organ movement was a neo-Baroque revival. Baroque values meant Baroque organs. In some cases, destroying, letting rot, perfectly serviceable Romantic-era organs that were suitable for Reger's grand style. The symphonic organs were the instruments Reger played on and wrote for. Baroque organs are smaller, lighter, they're just built differently. They don't have as many stops, and they don't have as many manuals. You don't get that big, bombastic, huge orchestral sound. Even Karl Straube, his first big organ champion, edited Reger's works to fit the tastes of the Weimar-era organ movement, taking out dynamics and tempos he thought reflected Reger's weak-willed and unstable nature. Some friend. And this guy was as much a lifelong friend as anybody. During the Leipzig years, they even shared a city, and he was one of the last to have seen Reger alive. They had dinner the night Reger died. Reger's body of work sits between the old-school organ work of Bach, the chamber music of Beethoven and especially Brahms, and the complex harmonic language of his era. How he navigated between these traditions differed every time he sat down to write a new piece. His music is not some unique synthesis of this dialectic, it's a series of syntheses, picked for the context in which the piece would be presented. And so trying to say anything meaningful about Reger's music as a massive collected body of work over 1,000 different pieces requires a level of generality too great to be meaningful. And this is the reason he's ended up on the wayside of musicology. This tends to happen to prolific composers. Too much means you can't easily analyze it, leading to a situation where neither quality nor consistency matter. Your work ends up judged en masse. Reger sat at the end of the German Empire, looking back on a grand, long 19th century of German music with all of its many flowerings. And he took and he combined what he could, what he needed. In this sense, I think Reger offers a fine model for composers of the present day. We sit now looking back at a long 20th century full of so much eclecticism, so many different branches of experimentation, so many potential influences. Inheriting an experimental tradition can be daunting, can make you feel like you have to innovate some new ism totally from scratch. But Reger teaches us that you don't have to. Your voice as a composer can just be from combining the different things that you love. Just maybe don't care as much about what the critics say. And remember to always drink responsibly.